We start with that big story of a duel between the Supreme Court and President Trump.
In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. They're all coming in over the next week. We're making deals with all of them. And I said, if we don't make a deal, then we're going to tariff them an extra 5, 6, 7, 8%, whatever the difference is, and we'll take it that way. The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
That played out this week when the president gave his State of the Union address with the members of the court right up front. Jason Furman of Harvard takes us through the ramifications of the conflict for the economy and what likely comes next. So, Jason, we heard from President Trump this week in the State of the Union address, and he sort of gave a State of the Economic Union. And among other things, he said we have plunging inflation, we have rapidly rising incomes, and the economy's roaring like it's never roared before. Is he right?
To a first approximation, the year since Donald Trump became president, economically was very similar to the year before he was president. It's actually been a perfectly good year. It's not the horror that Democrats might have predicted, but it's certainly not any sort of turning point that Donald Trump was trying to brag about either.
As an economist looking at the U.S. economy right now, what are the strong points?
We've had steady growth. It continued in 2025 at the same pace it was in 2024, which was a pretty good pace. There's some tentative signs that maybe productivity growth is picking up a little. It's only a smidge, but hopefully it's a hint of what's to come. The unemployment rate has basically stabilized.
How much of that good news in the economy do you think is because of AI, both the investment in AI and the promise of AI?
I think some of it is. AI was a big factor on the demand side in the economy in 2025. It could be an even bigger factor in 2026. That's all the money that's spent building data centers, the energy to supply them, and the like. We're only just starting to see the first hints of AI showing up on the supply side of the economy. Productivity growth in 2025 looks like it'll be maybe a little bit above the pace we had in the previous cycle, but only a little bit above. So, early days on supply, but a lot of demand.
When it comes to tariffs, President Trump, in his remarks, made it clear he's sticking with tariffs. Whatever the Supreme Court sitting right in front of him thinks about tariffs, he's going to go ahead with them. What has that really done to the economy? Has it had a lot of effect?
I think it has subtracted a bit from growth and added a meaningful amount to inflation. The inflation one is easier to prove. You can just look through the different types of goods and furniture, consumer electronics, and you see those prices rising, and normally you would have expected them to be stable at a time like this. So it really is showing up. Is it a dramatic recession or an apocalypse? Definitely not. In fact, the models never predicted that you would have something that dramatic, but that doesn't mean that we should be blasé about what might be tens of billions of dollars of damage to the economy.
Business leaders often talk about uncertainty and how that is really a dampener on growth for them. Whatever the tariff rate is, tell me what it is and I'll deal with it, as opposed to I'm not sure. There's been a lot of uncertainty, both in the way the tariffs were imposed and now with the Supreme Court decision. Can you approximate what that might mean for the economy? Is it having an effect on the economy?
Probably. It leads to some delay of investment, some desire to do things overseas rather than in the United States. The Supreme Court decision, I think, ultimately will give us more certainty, because the IEEPA tariffs that the president had been doing before, he'd been constantly changing them at a drop of a hat. He didn't like the tone of voice, didn't like a television ad in another country, tariffs go up. The new authorities that he's still going to have, like Section 301, take more time and effort. They're hard to change them on a dime. And so if he wants to have high tariffs, we're going to have high tariffs. He can't quite change them on a whim in the way he was doing before under the new legal regime.
Over and above the direct effect on trade from tariffs, there are also these agreements that the Trump administration has been entering into or trying to enter into, and they involve investment in the United States and other sort of concessions. How much could they help the economy, or in their absence, hurt the economy?
Most of those agreements are relatively minor. They're repackaging stuff that probably already would have happened anyway. Or maybe you get more investment coming from Japan or Korea in one form, but then they buy fewer treasuries and you get less investment in some other form, and it all washes out on the other end. So I don't see very much upside for the U.S. economy from those agreements.
In his State of the Union address, President Trump suggested once again that maybe tariffs could replace income tax. How feasible is that?
That's ludicrous. Income tax collects over $10 trillion over the next decade, and the tariffs are in the hundreds of billions per year. There's no comparison between them.
Even if the tariffs cannot replace income tax, it is money coming into the Treasury at a time that goodness knows the United States could use money coming into the Treasury. No matter who gets to be president, do you think we can ever take these tariffs back off from a fiscal side?
The one respect in which tariffs are working is they are raising revenue. It's just that there are so many other ways to raise revenue that would be less harmful to the U.S. economy. So I would much rather we not frame the discussion around, do we want tariffs or nothing? I'd rather the conversation be, do we want tariffs, or do we find another way to replace that revenue, maybe also do some spending cuts that's much more economically sensible?
The Supreme Court struck down President Trump's tariffs, something the president called unfortunate. But the justices left it to the lower courts to decide on appropriate remedies. Before the decision, we went over the options with Jennifer Hillman, a senior fellow for trade and international political economy at the Council on Foreign Relations.
So if the court rules that the tariffs were illegal from the get-go, then the tariffs must be refunded to those that have paid them. And if we look, to date through at least the end of August, that means about $88 to $100 billion worth of tariffs would need to be refunded to the importers that paid those tariffs in the first instance. Because if they're unlawful, then everyone is entitled to a refund with interest.
Is there a mechanism for doing that? That sounds like an enormous undertaking.
There is a mechanism, but you are correct, it is an enormous undertaking. And it basically splits out into whether or not the particular import of this particular item in this particular shipment, whether or not all of the paperwork that Customs has to do about those has closed or not. In Customs parlance, we say the entries have been liquidated. So for all of the entries that have not yet closed out, everyone can go back in and say, I made a mistake, in essence, on my import declaration. I don't owe any tariffs under IEEPA. I'm going to change my declaration, and I don't owe any of these tariffs, and you owe me a refund. For all of the entries that have already closed out, then there is a 180-day period in which you can file effectively a protest that in essence says to the Customs Service, you overcharged me, and you owe me a refund. But again, the Trump administration could make this a very easy, straightforward process. Everybody that applies automatically gets their refunds. Or they can make it a very difficult process. If they want to challenge each and every entry, if they want to say, you need to provide more information, you haven't given us everything that we need, they could make this a very difficult process. And again, for the big importers that have all of the paperwork readily available, they are likely to, again, go ahead and move to process all of their refunds. It's going to be those small businesses, and they're the ones that have been hurting the most from these tariffs. They're going to have the most difficulty if this process is difficult. They don't know exactly what paperwork to file. If the Trump administration were to decide to try to fight all of this and make everyone challenge in individual lawsuits, the question will come whether all these small businesses, do they have enough money to pay the legal fees? Do they know how to go through the process? And whether or not, again, this is going to be a requirement that you have to do this entry by entry, or whether there's going to be a much broader ability to process refunds at more, again, on a group and on a sort of nationwide basis. So again, it's going to depend. But as a matter of law, if the tariffs are illegal, refunds should be paid.